Heidegger believes that each epoch in human history poses specific challenges to us, and what characterizes the human being is that we must always learn how to dwell on the earth again. Our age is especially challenging because of the hegemony of what he calls the Gestell. The Gestell, or enframing, is the essence of modern technology, which according to Heidegger determines the way humans understand the totality of beings today. In our times, everything appears to us as inherently meaningless reservoir of resources that only become significant to us insofar as they can be measured by science and optimized by technology in the quest for maximum profit. What's so problematic and unique about the Gestell is that humanity comes to be seen as one entity more, undistinguishable in value or dignity to inanimate objects. In this manner, the Gestell is also one of the chapters in Heidegger's personal depiction of the history of Western thought as ontotheology. This take on the history of metaphysics aims to point out a certain paradox. The idea is that those systems of modern philosophy where everything was understood in reference to the subject are the very roots of our present hegemonic understanding of being, where the figure of the subject comes to disintegrate itself in the blind pursuit of maximum profit that we may deem capital. This objectivation of the subject is epitomized in the concept of human resources. People are seen as resources to be measured by means of percentiles, IQ tests, and so on in order to be exploited in the most efficient ways. While modern philosophers such as Bacon or Descartes reduce nature to a mere object to be dissected by reason and exploited for human interest, our times lead to a paradoxical situation where humans are no longer the ones who benefit from this exploitation. Instead, capital comes occupy the central position in relation to which all entities, including the human being, acquire meaning insofar as they can be optimized to render the maximum desired output. The threat that modern technology poses is twofold. On the hand, we have the concrete threat of the end of life on Earth as a consequence of either an atomic war or an ecological catastrophe. On the other hand, we have the ontological threat to humanity's essence, which especially concerns Heidegger. Humanity's essence is unconcealment, which means, simply, our ability to take things as something. The emphasis lies in the as of the phrasal verb taking as. Heidegger's thesis is that every way of approaching entities carries with it an implicit ontology that predeterminates our interpretation of its nature. This can sound a little bit difficult to understand, but we can take James Cameron's film Avatar as an example. The humans in the film have a very different approach to the planet Pandora in comparison to the ones of the native population. While humans see a rich reservoir of natural resources yet to be exploited, the natives see a world that doesn't need to be modified by their hand in order to acquire any meaning. Instead, each of its elements, from the largest animals to the most insignificant plant, is seen as a sacred entity that deserves to be respected as much. Heidegger believes that a similar approach to entities guided human beings before the forgetting of being, which is one of the names he gives to history of Western thought. Since the Gestell compels us to accept as knowledge only what is susceptible of being measured and quantified, the uncanny possibility is that a properly philosophical reflection of our essence will be forever out of reach, thus making our forgetting of being permanent. Of course, the point is not to reject science, but to recognize that there are many dimensions of human existence that cannot be understood by means of the scientific method. A good example of this uncanny attempt to extend science's scope beyond this limit is the series Glad You Asked by YouTube channel Box. Such questions as what happens after we die are attempted to be answered from a strictly scientific point of view. The absurdity of this approach can be seen in the video titled Why Do We Cry? There the question is posed to an evolutionary psychologist who, unsurprisingly, claims that it is very likely that crying was a survival mechanism. What else could it be if we adopt an evolutionary theory's ontology where everything is a survival mechanism? Heidegger's point is not that we need to reject science, but that if human nature is left to be explained in purely scientific terms, something very important will be lost. Namely, the possibility of approaching entities as something more than blind mechanisms that seek only to maximize and optimize themselves in a meaningless struggle for self-preservation.
In contrast to those conservative critics who claim we are entering an era of disbelief, a godless world, hedonist, and so on, I disagree totally. First, We don't live in an era of hedonism. We live in an era of strictly controlled, regulated hedonism. You know, like, what do I mean by this? On my flight from Europe here, I read in Hemispheres, the Journal of United Airlines, one of the most depressing articles that I've read. It was an article celebrating sex, why sex is good. But it describes it in these pragmatic terms. They say a good orgasm helps heart working, blood circulation is good, kissing fortifies your lips and so on, whatever good, I don't know. It's an, you know, this is how. Yes, sex, but healthy sex. Yes, drink, but beer without alcohol, whatever, whatever.
Heidegger seems to deposit his hopes in art, somewhat enigmatically suggesting that art and poetry will rescue us from this grim future. In order to understand Heidegger's philosophy of art, we must first elucidate the concept of earth. This concept is systematically polysemic, in a way that challenges the assumption, systematically championed by the analytical tradition, that we must define our concepts precisely and avoid conceptual conflation at all costs. The first sense of this concept of earth is purely concrete, what Heidegger would call ontic, as opposed to ontological or semiotic. It refers to the concrete material that the artist manipulates in the process of his or her work. For example, the piece of marble for the sculpture, sound for the musician, or language for the poet. This material offers a concrete resistance to the hand of the artist. It is not inherently meaningless, since the artist must assume a certain attitude of respect towards it. The material is not seen as something that has to be pushed to its limits or explored in the process of making the work. Rather, one could say that what the artist does is create the conditions that allow the material to speak for itself. On the other hand, the earth is that dimension of intelligibility that resists interpretation. In The Origin of the Work of Art, Heidegger offers a phenomenology of one of Van Gogh's paintings titled A Pair of Shoes. In experiencing this work, Heidegger arrives at the concept of strife as art's essence. This strife takes place between what is unconcealed, what conceals itself in the painting. According to Heidegger, the pair of shoes unconceal the world of a countrywoman, since their mere presence puts us in front of the whole chain of significant relations that exist between the farmer and her surroundings. Through the mere image of the shoes, we come to think of her waking up daily in the early morning to work with the soil and so on. However, the shoes are surrounded by an inchoate background that lends itself to various gestaltic configurations that escape our grasp as soon as we try to retain them. This is a perfect visualization of the semiotic sense of the concept of earth. It is that dimension of meaning that remains open to dynamic interpretations, never being fully capable of being abstracted in precise conceptual bonds. By unconcealing the world by means of art, we have at our disposal a mode of unconcealment different from that of the Gestalt. That is, art doesn't demand from being to completely reduce itself to a set of mathematical formulas or concepts, but rather accepts the inherently dynamic and inexhaustible character of being. Just as no conceptual interpretation of a work can ever fully do justice to it, Heidegger's point is that our relation with being, or the earth, is likewise provisional. No metaphysical system, including science's approach to nature, can ever claim to have arrived at a definitive account of reality. Heidegger's intentional conflation of the ontic and the semiotic aspects of the concept of earth aims to show the essential connection between these two. It is a concrete earth that lives in the work, what makes it fundamentally opaque and resists our attempts at reducing it with concepts. However, there seems to be yet another dimension to the concept of earth which makes itself evident in his public speech titled Memorial Address. There, it is claimed that our capacity to make great works of art depends on our being rooted firmly in the soil of our homeland. Heidegger refers to this rooting as autochthony. To what extent Heidegger's nationalism and his involvement with the Nazi Party follows from his philosophy, or whether it is something that we can extirpate from his thought, is a thorny question. What is clear, however, is that Heidegger's appeal to nationalism is a reaction to the Gestalt. Aside from the characteristics that we have already mentioned, our age also carries with it the shortening of all distances in space and time. Globalization is a direct consequence of modern technology. Local traditions are lost to be replaced by a normalized global culture. As such, the thesis that we need to remain rooted in a homeland is a reactionary attempt to hold back from the Gestell. Heidegger's romanticization of the German countrywoman in the origin of the work of art could be accepted, at first, as an innocent example of someone whose relationship with the earth retains a way of unconcealing different to that of the Gestell. But, in light of this nationalist claim that we need to be rooted in a homeland, the example comes to be grimly reminiscent of the Nazi motto blood and soil. Of course, we cannot accept this, and it is very doubtful that nationalism is the answer to save humanity's essence. However, in the memorial address, Heidegger also comes to acknowledge the failure of this approach and exhorts us to think so that we may find a way to dwell properly in the times of the Gestell. What we need to find is a new sense of autochthony that does not imply a reactionary appeal to nationalism.
This may surprise many of you, but you know that I began as a Heideggerian. My first book was on Heidegger and language in Slovene. No, I don't. Today, I would settle accounts with that book in Nazi style, burn it, you know.
The philosopher Slavoj Zizek offers us a possible avenue to think of this new autochthony. In response to Heidegger's stance that we need to be rooted in a homeland and the Nazi undertones of this claim, Zizek asks, what if, at the most radical level, we're all Jews? What if being rootless is the primordial state of being human, and our roots are a secondary phenomenon, an attempt to obfuscate our constitutive rootlessness? In the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel presents us a history of the various ways in which Western thought has attempted to find grounds for itself. Absolute knowledge is the last phase in this history. Here, human consciousness comes to realize that this reason-giving process is doomed to fail, and that the only grounds available to consciousness is its own ground-giving activity itself. That is, consciousness comes to ground itself in an Aufgrund. Following Hegel, then the question is, can we find our lost roots in our own rootless condition? You can watch my video on the dialectics of jazz fusion where I explain Zizek's interpretation of the Hegelian dialectics. The idea is that in light of an event that challenges our whole approach to life, we have two very different courses of action at our disposal. We can either negate the event in what would amount to a reactionary conservatism, or embrace the event and dare to transform ourselves in the process. This is what Hegel calls sublimation. Clinging to a primitive idea of an essential connection between our native soil and thus would amount to a negation of the event of the Gestell. However, the late Heidegger himself comes to recognize that this is doomed to fail and that what we need is not to reject modern technology, but rather seek a sublimation of its essence. This supposes that we accept changes brought about by modern technology, but also that we transform ourselves in the process. The question is then, is there a way to preserve our essence as unconcealment in the times of the Gestell? I argue that this self-reflexive movement that allows us to stay rooted in our own rootless condition characterizes modern art, which is explicitly self-referential. It is worth noting that the shoes that Van Gogh painted were not those of a countrywoman as Heidegger thought, but his own shoes. Heidegger could only arrive at his concept of strife because Van Gogh's painting made the essence of art explicit to him. Contrary to realist paintings whose aim is to conceal the fact that they are man-made artifices, Van Gogh's brush strokes embrace the art character of the art. By doing away with the precise and defined lines of realism, the painting comes to exhibit the bare earth in its own presence. The world that the painting unconceals is then not that of a countrywoman, but that of an artist. The earth that surrounds the shoes should not be understood in terms of the national soil of Germany, but rather as that dimension of being which resists totalitarian closure. This type of art is not only self-reflexive, but transcendental in the Kantian sense. By choosing art itself as its subject matter, modern art comes to exhibit its own conditions of possibility, and insofar as it is through art that we have historically given ourselves roots, for example, through the founding myths and epics of ancient cultures, transcendental art allows us to find our roots in our own root-seeking activity. Our essence is saved without rejecting modern technology or seeking some sort of insight into the nature of being by becoming German farms. Modern art offers us a new autochthony that doesn't involve the notion of an essential connection between our nation's soil and us, but rather takes our rooting to be a self-reflexive process. This is achieved through the creation of works which make us confront our own essence as unconcealing subjects. This requires from us that we embrace an essential modification of what it means to dwell in a world today. The American philosopher Don Ide claims that the pictures of the planet Earth from space are very un-Heideggerian, since they force us to abandon our notion of Earth as ground by presenting us with a wholly different outlook on our home, the Earth as globe. However, Heidegger's Gelassenheit is precisely an excitation for thought to try and build for itself a new home, where it may dwell despite these radical transformations in our essence. All of Tarantino's films are a celebration of the medium of cinema, but this is taken to a next level in Inglorious Basterds. All of the characters revolve around the medium in some way or another. Shoshana is a theatre owner, her boyfriend is a projectionist, Sola is a Nazi soldier who is given the opportunity to play himself in one of Goebbels' propaganda films, the British spy in charge of Operation Kino is a film scholar, and so on. A major device of self-reflective movies is the film inside the film. In this case, it is a nation's pride, a piece of propaganda. Propaganda is a perfect example of a reactionary art. That is, a work that attempts to preserve the primitive function of art of giving roots to a people at all costs. In the midst of the Gestell, this implies a degradation of art's own essence since, in order to achieve this, art must be subordinated to politics. Transcendental art is the opposite, since in these works all that matters is art itself. Tarantino's film comes to take revenge against the insult to the media of cinema that was Goebbels' propaganda. The climax of the film takes place in Shoshana's theatre. Hitler and all his closest men come to watch the premiere of Goebbels' film. However, in Inglorious Basterds, cinema is the very substance of reality, and as such, its omnipotence does not allow the heresy of reducing the medium to propaganda. Hitler's visit to the theatre, his intrusion into these holy lands, awakens the wrath of Tarantino's god, cinema itself. The very materiality of the medium allows cinema to rebel itself against its improper usage. The nitrate film, the enclosed space of the theatre, the sound of the shots that mirror and hide the actual bullets that are fired behind the film projector, are what brings the Nazi down in this alternate history. Inglorious Basterds has been deemed a Jewish revenge film. Insofar as Zizek is right that we are all Jews in the sense that being rootless is essential to our nature, I think that this is a perfect description of Tarantino's film. Propaganda is precisely that secondary phenomenon that attempts to obfuscate our rootless nature with artificial roots. Our weapon against it is a free form of art which, as Hegel saw, is one of the fundamental ways that we humans have to reflect on our essence.